70 years. That's how long it took for the mud at the bottom of Lake Guntersville to give up its darkest secret. 70 years of silence. 70 years of a family wondering what happened to their daughter. 70 years of unanswered questions that haunted an entire Alabama community. But in August 2022, when the water receded during one of the worst droughts in state history, the lake finally spoke. And what it revealed would shatter everything everyone thought they knew about the disappearance of Coraline Whitlock and Jonas Concaid. This is Cold Case Reels, and tonight, we're diving into a mystery that proves the truth never stays buried forever. Before we begin this journey into one of Alabama's most haunting, unsolved cases, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on your notifications. Because what you're about to hear is a story 70 years in the making, and you won't want to miss a single detail. Drop a like on this video if you believe that justice, no matter how long it takes, always finds its way to the surface. And comment below with your location. I want to know how far across America this story is reaching. Now, let's go back to where it all began, the summer of 1952. Coleman, Alabama. It was a time when diners stayed open late for truckers, when highways were dark ribbons cutting through endless forests, and when two young people could vanish without a trace, leaving behind nothing but questions and a community forever changed. August in Alabama is unforgiving. The heat doesn't just touch your skin, it wraps around you like a heavy blanket, making every breath feel thick and labored. Even at night, when the sun finally dips below the horizon and darkness spreads across the land, the humidity clings to everything. The air smells like pine and earth, mixed with the faint metallic scent of water from nearby lakes and streams. On this particular night in late August 2022, 70 years after Coraline and Jonas disappeared, investigator Mark Ellison found himself standing at the edge of Lake Guntersville. But this wasn't a recreational visit. This wasn't a fishing trip or a peaceful evening watching the sunset. This was work. Specifically, a drought survey. Alabama was experiencing one of its worst droughts on record, and Lake Guntersville's water levels had dropped so dramatically that sections of shoreline that hadn't been exposed in decades were now visible. Mark's flashlight cut through the darkness, its beam catching on twisted tree roots that protruded from the cracked, dry mud like ancient fingers reaching up from the earth. He'd been walking the newly exposed shoreline for about an hour, documenting the water recession, taking notes, snapping photographs. Standard procedure for this type of environmental survey. But then he saw something that made him stop cold. At first, it looked like just another piece of debris. Lake bottoms are full of them. Old tires, fishing equipment, random pieces of metal and plastic that accumulate over years of human activity. But as Mark moved closer, directing his flashlight beam more carefully over the area, he realized this wasn't debris. This was something else entirely. His hand moved to his radio almost instinctively. "Command Center, I need the forensics team at this location right now." His voice was steady, professional, but there was an undercurrent of urgency that couldn't be hidden. "We may have just found something connected to the 1952 case." The words echoed across the empty expanse of dried lake bed, mingling with the sound of wind whistling through the treetops and the faint crackling sound of the receding water somewhere in the distance. What had begun as a routine environmental survey had just transformed into something that would reopen one of Alabama's oldest and most haunting mysteries. Within 45 minutes, the forensics team arrived. Portable lights were set up, creating an island of harsh white illumination in the surrounding darkness. The team worked methodically, carefully excavating the area where Mark had made his initial discovery. And with each passing minute, with each careful brush of soil and sediment, the magnitude of what they'd found became clearer. just a few feet from what had been the lake's edge before the drought, buried beneath a shallow layer of mud and decomposed organic material. The team uncovered fragments of bone. Human bone. The skeletal remains were incomplete, scattered by decades of water movement and natural decomposition, but they were unmistakably human. And there was something else, something that made every person at that excavation site go quiet. A necklace. Silver, tarnished black by decades underwater, but still intact, still recognizable. The forensics photographer moved in, documenting every angle, every detail, and when the necklace was carefully lifted from the mud and placed in an evidence bag, everyone there knew exactly what they were looking at. It was the necklace Coraline Whitlock was wearing the night she disappeared. For more than half a century, the disappearance of Coraline Whitlock and Jonas Concaid had been an open wound in the Coleman community. It was the kind of case that people whispered about, the kind that parents referenced when warning their children about the dangers of the world, the kind that never quite faded from collective memory, no matter how many years passed. They were young. Coraline was 23 years old. Jonas was 25. They were in love, planning a future together, taking a road trip through Alabama before settling down. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives until the night of August 15th, 1952, when they stopped at a diner on Highway 31 and vanished into the darkness. For 70 years, their families waited for answers. For 70 years, investigators followed leads that went nowhere. For 70 years, the case file sat in storage, marked with those haunting words: missing, circumstances undetermined. But now, in August 2022, everything was about to change. The drought that had devastated Alabama's agriculture and strained its water resources had done something else. It had exposed the truth, and that truth was about to unravel a story of violence, deception, and secrets that had been buried for nearly 7 decades. Let me take you back to where this all started, back to that summer night in 1952, back to the Highway 31 diner where Coraline and Jonas had their last meal, back to the moment when 2 young people, with their whole lives ahead of them, walked out into the darkness and were never seen again. The summer of 1952 was hot and humid, even by Alabama standards. The kind of summer where the air feels thick enough to swim through, where thunderstorms roll across the sky in the late afternoon, bringing brief relief before the heat settles back in even stronger than before. It was a summer of Korean War headlines and election year politics, of new television shows and the latest Elvis Presley records playing on jukeboxes in diners across America. Coleman, Alabama, was a small town then, even smaller than it is now. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where a stranger stood out immediately, where life moved at a slower pace than in the big cities up north or out west. The town sat along Highway 31, which meant it saw a steady stream of travelers passing through. Truckers, mostly, hauling goods from one state to another, stopping for coffee and a hot meal before continuing their journeys into the night. The diner on Highway 31 was called simply the Highway Diner, and it was the kind of establishment that existed all across America in the 1950s. Red vinyl booths, a long counter with chrome-backed stools, a jukebox in the corner playing the latest hits, the smell of coffee constantly brewing, mixing with the scent of frying bacon and fresh-baked pie, the soft clink of silverware against ceramic plates, the murmur of conversation punctuated by the occasional laugh or the ding of the bell when someone pushed through the front door. It was the kind of place where locals came for breakfast on Sunday mornings after church, where teenagers gathered after football games on Friday nights, where truckers could get a decent meal and maybe a slice of pecan pie before hitting the road again. It was an anchor point in the community, a gathering place, a neutral ground where people from all walks of life could sit side by side at the counter and share a meal. On the night of August 15th, 1952, Coraline Whitlock and Jonas Concaid walked into the highway diner sometime around 8:30 in the evening. They'd been on the road most of the day, driving through Alabama on what was meant to be a romantic road trip before they got married in the fall. They were tired, hungry, and looking forward to a hot meal before continuing their journey north toward Tennessee. The waitress that night was a woman named Dorothy Mills. She was 42 years old, had worked at the diner for nearly a decade, and had a reputation for remembering her customers and making everyone feel welcome. Years later, when the investigation began in earnest, Dorothy would be interviewed multiple times about that night, and her memory of Coraline and Jonas would prove to be remarkably clear. They were a sweet couple, she told investigators. You could tell they were in love just by the way they looked at each other. They sat in the booth by the window, the one that looks out over the parking lot. They weren't loud or rowdy, just quiet, talking to each other, smiling. The kind of young people who make you feel hopeful about the world, you know? Coraline ordered the chicken fried steak with mashed potatoes and green beans. Jonas got the meatloaf special. They shared a piece of apple pie for dessert and drank coffee, regular for him, decaf for her. They stayed for about an hour, maybe a little longer, talking quietly, laughing occasionally, completely absorbed in each other's company. Dorothy remembered that Coraline wore a light blue dress with small white flowers on it. She had dark hair that fell just past her shoulders, and she wore it pulled back with a clip. Around her neck was a silver necklace, a delicate chain with a small pendant. Jonas wore dark slacks and a white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He had light brown hair, neatly combed, and an easy smile that made him look younger than his 25 years. They seemed happy, relaxed, completely unaware that they were living the last peaceful moments of their lives. Around 9:45, Jonas signaled for the check. Dorothy brought it over, exchanged a few pleasantries about where they were heading, and wished them safe travels. Jonas left a generous tip, more than the standard 15%. Coraline smiled at Dorothy and said, "Thank you so much. The food was wonderful." Then they stood up, gathered their jackets, and walked toward the door. Outside, the August night had settled over the parking lot with a thin, damp mist, the kind that doesn't quite count as fog, but makes everything look slightly blurred, slightly unreal. The yellow glow from the diner's neon sign spilled out onto the cracked asphalt, creating pools of light separated by deep shadows. A few other vehicles were parked in the lot, a couple of long-haul trucks, their massive forms looming in the darkness, a sedan belonging to one of the diner's cooks, and Coraline and Jonas's Ford van parked under the lot's only streetlight. The van was a 1949 Ford, painted a deep green that looked almost black in the dim light. Jonas had bought it earlier that summer specifically for this trip. He'd outfitted the back with a mattress and some storage space, turning it into a mobile home of sorts for their journey. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs, and they loved it. As Coraline and Jonas stepped out of the diner and into the parking lot, pulling their jackets closed against the evening breeze that swept across the pavement, something happened that would later become one of the most crucial details in the entire investigation. They were noticed, not by Dorothy or the other diner staff, not by the cook or the handful of other customers still inside. They were noticed by someone outside, someone standing in the shadows at the edge of the parking lot, someone who, according to later witness testimony, had been there for a while, watching and waiting. A man in a gray fedora. Robert Bobby Jenkins was a long-haul trucker from Georgia, 47 years old, married with 3 kids. He'd been driving trucks for nearly 20 years and knew every stretch of Highway 31 like the back of his hand. On the night of August 15th, Bobby had pulled into the Highway Diner's parking lot around 8 o'clock for dinner and a short rest before continuing his run to Nashville. His truck was parked on the far side of the lot, giving him a clear view of most of the parking area. Bobby was sitting in his truck's cab, finishing a cigarette, and looking over his route maps when he noticed the man in the gray fedora. This was sometime around 9:30, about 15 minutes before Coraline and Jonas came out of the diner. He was just standing there, Bobby would later tell police, over by the metal railing at the edge of the lot, kind of in between the lights, where it was mostly shadow. I noticed him because he wasn't doing anything, you know? He wasn't walking to a car. He wasn't going into the diner. He was just standing there, real still, looking toward the diner entrance. Bobby didn't think much of it at first. People did odd things. Maybe the guy was waiting for someone. Maybe he was having an argument with his wife and needed some air. Maybe he was just taking a moment to himself before getting back on the road. But as the minutes passed, the man didn't move. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, the brim of his fedora pulled low enough to shadow his face. Then Coraline and Jonas came out. Bobby watched as the young couple emerged from the diner, laughing about something, their voices carrying across the quiet parking lot. He watched as they walked toward their Ford van, parked under the streetlight. And he watched as the man in the gray fedora's posture changed. He straightened up, Bobby recalled, like he'd been waiting for something and it had finally happened. His head turned to follow them. And I remember thinking it was odd, the way he was watching them. Not casual, you know? Focused, like he knew them or something. Coraline glanced in the man's direction once. Even from his position across the lot, Bobby could see her pace quicken slightly. She said something to Jonas, too quiet for Bobby to hear. Jonas turned his head, looking toward where the man stood in the shadows. Bobby saw Jonas's brow crease, saw him hesitate for just a moment before continuing toward the van. They reached the vehicle. Jonas unlocked the back doors, and they loaded their small overnight bags inside. They moved efficiently, quickly, like people who were suddenly eager to be on their way. Jonas opened the driver's side door. Coraline walked around to the passenger side. Within moments, they were both inside the van. The engine turned over with a low rumble. The headlights flickered on, cutting through the misty darkness. Bobby watched as the van backed out of its parking spot, the reverse lights glowing white. Then the van pulled forward, turning toward the parking lot exit that led back onto Highway 31. And throughout all of this, the man in the gray fedora stood perfectly still, watching. Bobby Jenkins watched too. He watched the Ford van's taillights disappear around the northward curve of Highway 31, swallowed by the darkness and the mist. He watched the man in the gray fedora remain motionless for another minute or so. And then he watched as the man finally moved, walking with purpose toward a car Bobby hadn't noticed before, parked in the deepest shadows at the very edge of the lot. Bobby couldn't see what kind of car it was. The darkness and mist obscured too many details, but he heard the engine start. He saw headlights come on, and he watched as the car pulled out of the parking lot, heading in the same direction Coraline and Jonas had gone, north on Highway 31. At the time, Bobby Jenkins thought it was strange, but nothing more. People drive in the same direction all the time, especially on a major highway. It didn't necessarily mean anything. So he finished his cigarette, climbed out of his truck cab, and went into the diner for a cup of coffee before hitting the road himself. He had no way of knowing that he was one of the last people to see Coraline Whitlock and Jonas Concaid alive. He had no way of knowing that his testimony about the man in the gray fedora would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in a case that would haunt Alabama for 70 years. The next morning, August 16th, 1952, dawned hot and clear. By 7 o'clock, the sun was already beating down on Coleman with the kind of intensity that promised another sweltering day. In a small house on Maple Street, Coraline's mother, Eleanor Whitlock, was beginning to worry. Coraline had promised to call when she and Jonas reached their next destination. The plan had been to drive to Nashville, spend a few days there, then continue on to Chattanooga before looping back through Alabama. Eleanor had expected to hear from her daughter by late evening, or, at the latest, first thing in the morning. But the phone hadn't rung. And when Eleanor tried calling the hotel where Coraline said they'd be staying, the front desk clerk told her no one by that name had checked in. By noon, worry had transformed into genuine fear. Eleanor called Jonas's parents. They hadn't heard from him either. She called friends in Nashville. No one had seen them. She called the highway patrol, but they had no reports of accidents involving a green Ford van on Highway 31. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Eleanor Whitlock and Jonas's father, William Concaid, drove together to the Coleman police station and filed a missing persons report. 2 young people, engaged to be married, had vanished after leaving the Highway Diner on Highway 31 the previous evening. They should have reached Nashville by early morning. No one had heard from them. Something was wrong. The Coleman Police Department in 1952 consisted of a chief, 2 full-time officers, and 1 part-time deputy. It was a small operation for a small town, used to dealing with traffic violations, the occasional drunk and disorderly, maybe a burglary every few months. Missing persons cases, especially ones involving young adults, who might have simply decided to extend their trip or change their plans, weren't usually cause for immediate alarm. But Chief Walter Hobson took the report seriously. There was something about the way Eleanor Whitlock's hands shook as she filled out the paperwork, something about the fear in William Concaid's eyes, that told him this wasn't a case of young people being irresponsible or forgetful. Something was genuinely wrong. By sunset on August 16th, less than 24 hours after Coraline and Jonas had driven away from the Highway Diner, the investigation had officially begun. Chief Hobson and his officers started at the most logical place, retracing the couple's last known movements. They returned to the Highway Diner, arriving just as the evening shift was starting. Dorothy Mills was there, preparing for another night of serving truckers and travelers, and she remembered Coraline and Jonas immediately. "Of course I remember them," she told Chief Hobson. "Sweet young couple. They left here around 9:45, maybe 9:50. Seemed perfectly fine. Happy, even. No arguments, no problems. They paid their bill, left a nice tip, and walked out together." Chief Hobson asked if Dorothy had noticed anything unusual, any strange interactions, anyone bothering them. Dorothy thought for a moment, then shook her head. Nothing like that. They kept to themselves mostly. Just talked to each other, ate their dinner, and left. But then Chief Hobson spoke with Bobby Jenkins, who had stopped at the diner again on his return route through Alabama. Bobby's testimony changed everything. He described the man in the gray fedora in as much detail as he could remember. Medium height, maybe 5'9" or 5'10". Average build, not particularly heavy or thin. The fedora was pulled low, obscuring most of his face, but Bobby thought he might have had dark hair. He was wearing what looked like a dark jacket or coat, unusual for such a warm night. He stood for at least 15 minutes in the same spot, barely moving, watching the diner entrance. And then when those kids came out, Bobby said, he watched them walk to their van. I mean, really watched them, like he was tracking their every move. And when they drove off, he followed them. I'm sure of it. He got in his car and drove off in the same direction, maybe 30 seconds after they left. Chief Hobson felt his stomach tighten. This wasn't young people being careless. This was something else, something darker. The investigation expanded rapidly. Highway patrol officers were contacted and asked to search Highway 31 heading north from Coleman. Every diner, every gas station, every motel along the route was contacted with descriptions of Coraline, Jonas, and their green Ford van. Volunteers from the community organized search parties to comb the forests and fields along the highway, looking for any sign of the missing couple. Days passed, then a week, then 2 weeks, and then, on September 2nd, 1952, 18 days after Coraline and Jonas disappeared, a farmer named Henry Blackwell made a discovery that would dominate headlines across Alabama and beyond. Henry owned a large tract of land, about 15 miles north of Coleman, just off Highway 31. The property was mostly forested, with a few cleared areas where Henry grew corn and soybeans. On this particular morning, Henry was walking one of his fence lines, checking for damage, when he saw something unusual about 50 yards into the woods. A vehicle. A green Ford van, partially hidden by undergrowth and tree branches. Henry's heart started pounding. He'd heard about the missing couple. Everyone in the area had. He approached the van carefully, not knowing what he might find. The driver's side door was slightly ajar. The windows were intact. There were no obvious signs of damage to the vehicle itself. Henry opened the door wider and looked inside. The van was empty. No people. No bodies. But there were signs that someone had been there. The keys were still in the ignition. A woman's purse sat on the passenger seat. Maps were scattered on the floor. In the back, where Jonas had set up sleeping space, blankets were tangled and disheveled. Henry immediately drove back to his house and called the police. Within an hour, Chief Hobson and his entire force were at the scene. The van was photographed from every angle. Every inch of the interior was searched and documented. Evidence was carefully collected and bagged. And gradually, a picture began to emerge, though it raised more questions than it answered. The keys in the ignition suggested the van hadn't been stolen in the traditional sense. If someone wanted to steal a vehicle, they'd take the keys with them, or at least remove them from the ignition. The presence of Coraline's purse, containing her identification, some cash, and personal items, suggested this wasn't a robbery. If money had been the motive, the purse would have been taken. The disheveled blankets in the back suggested some kind of struggle or hurried movement. But there was no blood, no signs of violence inside the vehicle itself, no broken glass or torn upholstery, or anything else that might indicate a fight. The van had been driven or pushed into the woods deliberately. It was too far from the road to have simply rolled there by accident. Someone had taken the time to hide it, to conceal it from view. But why? And where were Coraline and Jonas? The discovery of the van transformed the investigation. This was no longer a missing persons case with the possibility of a benign explanation. This was now almost certainly a crime scene. The question was, what crime? And where were the victims? Search teams descended on Henry Blackwell's property. Dozens of volunteers, police officers, and eventually even some state police investigators combed through hundreds of acres of forest. They searched for any sign of Coraline and Jonas, clothing, personal items, disturbances in the soil that might indicate a grave, anything. They found remarkably little. About 100 yards from where the van was discovered, investigators found a wallet. It belonged to Jonas Concaid. It still contained his driver's license and a small amount of cash. Another 50 yards beyond that, they found a set of keys on a keyring shaped like a small dog. Coraline's mother confirmed these belonged to her daughter. But that was it. No more personal items. No clothing. No signs of a struggle. No bodies. The forest, dense with undergrowth and decades of accumulated leaf litter, kept its secrets. The search continued for 3 weeks. As September turned into October and the weather began to cool, the number of volunteers dwindled. People had to return to their jobs, their families, their lives. The police continued searching, but with each passing day, hope faded a little more. By mid-October, Chief Hobson had to make a difficult decision. With no new evidence, no new leads, and no indication of where Coraline and Jonas might be, he had to scale back the active search. The case would remain open, but the intensive day-to-day investigation couldn't continue indefinitely with no progress. On October 28, 1952, a brief note was added to the case file. Missing. Circumstances undetermined. Investigation ongoing. The file was moved to a storage cabinet, where it would remain for the next 70 years. But the impact of the disappearance didn't end with the closing of the active investigation. For the families of Coraline Whitlock and Jonas Concaid, the pain was just beginning. Eleanor Whitlock never stopped believing her daughter would come home. Every time the phone rang, every time there was a knock at the door, she hoped it would be Coraline. Or at least news about Coraline. Something. Anything. She kept Coraline's room exactly as it had been the day her daughter left. The closet still held her clothes. The dresser still held her jewelry and cosmetics. The bed was made with the same floral bedspread Coraline had picked out when she was 16. Eleanor couldn't bear to change anything, couldn't accept that her daughter might never walk through that door again. William Concaid, Jonas's father, responded differently. He became consumed with the investigation, spending hours at the police station, demanding updates, pushing for more searches, more interviews, more action. He created maps showing every possible route Jonas and Coraline might have taken. He drove Highway 31 himself dozens of times, stopping at every diner, every gas station, every business, showing photos of his son and Coraline, asking if anyone had seen them. He hired a private investigator, a former FBI agent named Marcus Riley, who specialized in missing persons cases. Riley spent 6 months working the case, re-interviewing witnesses, following up on tips, searching areas that police might have missed. But he found nothing new. Nothing that moved the investigation forward. The case became famous in the way that unsolved mysteries do. Newspapers across Alabama and neighboring states ran stories about the vanished couple. True crime magazines featured articles speculating about what might have happened. Was it a random act of violence by a stranger? A robbery gone wrong? A carefully planned abduction? Or had Coraline and Jonas, for reasons no one could fathom, chosen to disappear and start new lives somewhere else? That last theory never sat well with anyone who knew them. Coraline and Jonas weren't troubled people running from problems. They were happy, engaged, planning a wedding. They had families who loved them, friends who cared about them, futures they were excited about. The idea that they would voluntarily abandon everything and everyone made no sense. But without bodies, without evidence of foul play beyond the abandoned van, authorities couldn't definitively say what had happened. And so the case remained in limbo. Not quite a murder investigation because there were no confirmed victims. Not quite a missing persons case because the circumstances suggested something sinister. Just an open file gathering dust, waiting for a break that might never come. Years passed. The 1950s became the 1960s. The country changed. The Vietnam War came and went. Technology advanced. Civil rights movements reshaped American society. But in Coleman, Alabama, people still remembered Coraline Whitlock and Jonas Concaid. The case became part of local lore, a cautionary tale, a reminder that sometimes people vanish and are never found. Eleanor Whitlock died in 1978 at the age of 67. She never learned what happened to her daughter. William Concaid lived until 1993, dying at 81. He, too, went to his grave without answers. But their other children, the siblings of the missing pair, never forgot. They kept the case alive in whatever ways they could. They pushed for periodic reviews of the evidence. They updated missing persons databases when such things became available. They held on to hope that someday, somehow, the truth would come to light. And in August 2022, 70 years after that awful night, Their hope was finally validated. The discovery at Lake Guntersville sent shockwaves through the Alabama law enforcement community. This wasn't just about finding remains that might be linked to a 70-year-old cold case. This was about the possibility of finally solving one of the state's most enduring mysteries. The forensics team worked around the clock. The bone fragments found in the dried lake bed were carefully excavated, documented, and transported to the state crime lab. The silver necklace that had been identified as belonging to Coraline Whitlock was examined for any trace evidence that might have survived 7 decades underwater. But the real breakthrough came from something else entirely. Something that had been found years earlier, but never properly analyzed because the technology didn't exist at the time. In 1952, during the initial search of the area where the Ford van was discovered, investigators had found several items scattered in the woods. Most of them were documented, bagged, and stored. But one item, a small 35mm camera found about 20 yards from where Jonas's wallet was recovered, had been largely overlooked. The camera was in poor condition, partially buried in mud, its casing cracked and weathered. But more importantly, it still had film inside. In 1952, the technology to develop film that had been exposed to the elements for an unknown period of time was limited. There was a very real chance that attempting to develop it would destroy whatever images might be there. So the camera and its film were logged as evidence and stored away, undeveloped. 70 years later, with the case suddenly active again following the Lake Guntersville discovery, a young detective named Sarah Chen decided to review every piece of evidence from the original investigation. She found the camera, still in its evidence bag, still with the undeveloped film inside. Modern film development and enhancement techniques are light years beyond what was available in 1952. Sarah contacted a specialist in historic photograph recovery, a woman named Dr. Patricia Thornton, who had successfully developed and enhanced film from shipwrecks, archaeological sites, and old crime scenes. If anyone could recover images from 70-year-old water-damaged film, it was Dr. Thornton. The process took 3 weeks. Slowly, painstakingly, Dr. Thornton worked to develop the film using cutting-edge chemical processes and digital enhancement. And what she found was stunning. The camera had belonged to Jonas Concaid. He'd been taking photos throughout their road trip, documenting their journey. Most of the images on the roll were exactly what you'd expect. Scenic overlooks, Coraline smiling in front of roadside attractions, the two of them together in various locations, taken with a timer or by helpful strangers. But the last 3 images on the roll were different. They were dark, grainy, clearly taken in low-light conditions. The first showed what appeared to be a parking lot at night. The image was blurry, probably because Jonas had been moving when he took it. But you could make out vehicles, lights, shadows. The second image was sharper. It showed a figure standing near what appeared to be a railing. The figure was distant, partially obscured by darkness. But there was one detail that came through clearly when Dr. Thornton enhanced the image: a gray fedora. The third image was the most disturbing. It appeared to have been taken from inside a vehicle, possibly through a window. The angle was odd, tilted, as if the camera had been held hastily. The image showed headlights behind them, close, too close. And in the enhanced version, you could make out part of a license plate number. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. And while you're in the comments, tell me what you think these photos mean. Was Jonas documenting something that scared him? Did he realize they were being followed? Your engagement helps Cold Case Reels continue bringing these forgotten stories back to light. The partial license plate number from Jonas's photograph was a game changer. Even though it was only 4 digits out of 6, and even though it was from 1952 when record-keeping was far less comprehensive than it is today, It gave investigators something concrete to work with. Detective Sarah Chen, now leading the renewed investigation, contacted the Alabama Department of Motor Vehicles. She needed records from 1952 showing all vehicles registered in Alabama with those 4 digits in their license plate numbers. It was a long shot. Many of those records had been destroyed, lost, or damaged over the decades. But the DMV's archive department came through, providing a list of approximately 200 vehicles that fit the criteria. Of those 200, only about 37 were registered in or around the Coleman area in 1952. And of those 37, investigators were able to track down ownership records for 22. The process was tedious, involving searches through property records, census data, and old phone directories. Many of the original owners had died decades ago, but their names were there, preserved in documents and databases. While this was happening, the forensics team was making progress on the remains found at Lake Guntersville. DNA extraction from skeletal material that's been submerged in water for 70 years is incredibly difficult. Water degrades DNA. Time degrades DNA. The combination of both, over 7 decades, should have made extraction nearly impossible. But forensic science in the 21st century is capable of remarkable things. Using cutting-edge extraction techniques developed specifically for degraded samples, the forensics team was able to recover partial DNA profiles from the bone fragments. They weren't complete profiles. There were gaps, sections where the DNA was too degraded to sequence. But there was enough to compare against DNA samples from living relatives of Coraline Whitlock and Jonas Concaid. Coraline's niece, Margaret Whitlock Freeman, now 68 years old, provided a DNA sample, as did Jonas's nephew, David Concaid, 71. The samples were processed, the genetic markers compared. The results came back in early October 2022. The bone fragments found at Lake Guntersville were a match to the Whitlock family line. They were almost certainly the remains of Coraline Whitlock. But where was Jonas? Further excavation at the Lake Guntersville site uncovered additional bone fragments, approximately 30 feet from where Coraline's remains were found. These fragments were also tested, and they matched the Concaid family line. After 70 years, Coraline and Jonas had been found. But the discovery of their remains only deepened the mystery. How did they end up in Lake Guntersville? The lake was miles from where their van had been abandoned. And who put them there? The answer to those questions would come from an unexpected source: genealogy databases and a piece of evidence that had been sitting in the case file since 1952. During the original investigation, when the Ford van was processed for evidence, investigators had found several items in the back of the vehicle. Among them was a piece of nylon rope, approximately 3 feet long, with what appeared to be bloodstains on it. In 1952, blood typing was the extent of forensic analysis available. The blood on the rope was determined to be type O, which matched both Coraline and Jonas. But that was all investigators could learn from it at the time. The rope was bagged, documented, and stored with the rest of the evidence. For 70 years, it sat in an evidence locker, waiting for technology to catch up to its secrets. In November 2022, that rope was sent to the same forensic lab that had processed the skeletal remains. Using modern DNA extraction techniques, forensic scientists were able to recover DNA from skin cells that had transferred to the nylon fibers when someone handled the rope. This DNA didn't belong to Coraline or Jonas. It belonged to their killer. But having the killer's DNA was only useful if there was something to compare it to. This is where genealogical databases came into play, specifically a technique called forensic genetic genealogy. This method, which gained prominence in the late 20-teens with the capture of the Golden State Killer, involves uploading a DNA profile to public genealogy databases and looking for matches with relatives of the unknown subject. The process is complex and time-consuming. Even a close match doesn't immediately identify a suspect. Instead, it identifies relatives, sometimes distant ones, and investigators must build family trees and trace lineages to find the specific individual whose DNA was at the crime scene. Detective Sarah Chen worked with a genetic genealogist named Dr. Michael Bradshaw, who specialized in using these techniques for cold cases. Dr. Bradshaw uploaded the DNA profile from the rope to several public genealogy databases. Within days, he had hits. Multiple matches ranging from second cousins to fourth cousins. The real work then began. Dr. Bradshaw spent weeks building family trees, tracing branches, identifying descendants. He worked backwards from the database matches, finding common ancestors, then working forward through generations to identify individuals who would have been alive in 1952 and living in or near Coleman, Alabama. The work was meticulous. Each name had to be researched. Birth certificates, death certificates, marriage licenses, census records, city directories, newspaper archives. Every piece of information helped narrow the possibilities. And slowly, over the course of nearly 2 months, a picture began to emerge. The DNA on the rope led to a family that had deep roots in Alabama, multiple branches of the family tree spreading across generations. But one branch in particular caught Dr. Bradshaw's attention. A branch that included a man named Howard Fenwick, who in 1952 was 43 years old and lived approximately 8 miles from Coleman. Howard Fenwick worked as a manager at an agricultural supply company. He was married, had 2 children, and by all accounts was a respected member of his community. He served on the local school board. He attended church every Sunday. He coached his son's Little League team. He was, to anyone who knew him, an upstanding citizen. But there was something in Howard Fenwick's background that made investigators take a closer look. In 1946, 6 years before Coraline and Jonas disappeared, Howard had been questioned by police in connection with the disappearance of a young woman named Ruth Ann Parker. Ruth Ann was 19 years old when she vanished after leaving a church social in a town about 40 miles from Coleman. Her body was found 3 weeks later in a wooded area. She had been strangled. Howard Fenwick had been at the church social that night. Several witnesses remembered seeing him there, and one witness, a teenager named Billy Marsh, told police he'd seen Howard talking to Ruth Ann shortly before she left. Howard admitted to speaking with Ruth Ann, but said it was just a brief, friendly conversation. He said he'd left the social before Ruth Ann did and had gone straight home. Police questioned Howard multiple times, but there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime. No witnesses who saw him leave with Ruth Ann or saw him in the area where her body was found. His wife provided an alibi, saying he'd come home at the time he claimed. Without evidence, police couldn't charge him. The Ruth Ann Parker case remained unsolved, eventually going cold like so many others. Now, 76 years after Ruth Ann's murder, and 70 years after Coraline and Jonas disappeared, investigators were looking at Howard Fenwick in a new light. Was it possible that he was responsible for multiple crimes? That he'd gotten away with murder once and then struck again? Detective Sarah Chen began digging into every aspect of Howard Fenwick's life. Howard had died in 1989 at the age of 80, so he couldn't be questioned directly. But his life left traces, and those traces could still be examined. Property records showed that in 1952, Howard owned a small hunting cabin on property that bordered Lake Guntersville. The cabin was in a remote area, accessible only by a rough dirt road that wound through dense forest. It was the kind of place where someone could go and not be disturbed for days or weeks at a time. This was significant. Coraline and Jonas's remains had been found in Lake Guntersville, and Howard Fenwick owned property on that lake. Was that just a coincidence? Or was it evidence of opportunity and means? Sarah also discovered something else. In going through old property records and tax documents, she found that in 1951, 1 year before the murders, Howard had purchased a vehicle. The make, model, and year weren't listed in the records she found, but she did find something crucial: the license plate number. 4 of the 6 digits matched the partial plate number visible in Jonas Concaid's photograph. The odds of that being a coincidence were astronomical. Out of dozens of possible vehicles from the license plate search, out of hundreds of people who lived in the area, the DNA evidence and the photographic evidence were pointing to the same person: Howard Fenwick. But DNA on a rope and a partial license plate match, while compelling, weren't quite enough for a definitive conclusion. What investigators needed was something more. Some piece of evidence that would conclusively tie Howard Fenwick to the crime scene and to the murders of Coraline Whitlock and Jonas Concaid. That final piece came from Howard Fenwick's own family. Howard's son, Richard Fenwick, was still alive in 2022. He was 74 years old, living in a retirement community in Florida. When Detective Sarah Chen contacted him to ask about his father, Richard was initially reluctant to talk. But Sarah was patient, explaining that this was about finding justice for 2 young people who'd been murdered 70 years ago. She wasn't accusing Richard of anything. She just needed information about his father. Richard eventually agreed to meet with Sarah. What he told her, in a series of interviews conducted over several weeks, painted a picture of Howard Fenwick that was very different from the upstanding citizen most people remembered. "My father was a violent man," Richard said. "Not all the time. Most of the time he was fine, normal, but he had this rage inside him. You never knew when it would come out. Usually it was directed at my mother. He'd hit her, hurt her, and then the next day he'd act like nothing had happened. And she'd go along with it because that's what women did back then. They didn't leave. They didn't report it. They just endured." Richard remembered the summer of 1952 vividly, despite being only 4 years old at the time. He remembered his father coming home very late one night, sometime in mid-August. Richard had been awakened by the sound of his parents arguing downstairs. He'd crept to the top of the staircase and listened. My mother was saying something about blood, asking my father why there was blood on his clothes, and my father was telling her to shut up, to mind her own business. He was angry, angrier than I'd ever heard him. And then I heard him say something that I didn't understand at the time, but I never forgot. He said, "They saw too much. They couldn't be allowed to talk." Richard had gone back to bed, frightened and confused. The next morning, he'd tried to ask his mother about what he'd heard, but she'd shushed him immediately and told him to never mention it again. And he hadn't. Not for decades. Not until Detective Sarah Chen sat across from him in that Florida retirement community and asked him about his father. "I've thought about that night my whole life," Richard said. "Wondered what it meant. After I grew up and learned about those 2 young people who disappeared, I sometimes wondered if there was a connection. But I never said anything. I was afraid of what people would think, afraid of what it would mean if my father was a murderer. So I kept quiet, and I've regretted that every day since." Richard agreed to provide a DNA sample, which would serve as a direct familial comparison to the DNA found on the rope. The results confirmed what investigators already suspected. The DNA on the rope was from Howard Fenwick's family line, and the probability that it came from anyone other than Howard himself was infinitesimally small. With the DNA evidence, the photographic evidence, the property records, and Richard's testimony about what he'd overheard as a child, investigators were finally able to piece together what most likely happened on the night of August 15th, 1952. Howard Fenwick had been at the Highway Diner that night. Multiple witnesses had been interviewed over the years, and a few mentioned seeing a man in a fedora, though none of them could identify him. Howard, according to his son, owned several fedoras and wore them frequently. It was his signature look. Howard had noticed Coraline and Jonas, possibly because they were a young, attractive couple, possibly for reasons that will never be fully understood. He'd watched them from the shadows of the parking lot, waiting. When they left the diner and drove north on Highway 31, he followed them. At some point, Howard forced them off the road. Perhaps he used his vehicle to run them off. Perhaps he signaled that there was something wrong with their van, and they pulled over to check. However it happened, he got them to stop. And then he attacked them. The struggle that followed left evidence: the disheveled blankets in the back of the van, Jonas's wallet and Coraline's keys, dropped or thrown during the confrontation, the rope, which Howard likely used to restrain them, and the camera, which must have been knocked loose during the struggle, falling into the underbrush, where it would remain hidden for 70 years. Howard then drove Coraline and Jonas to his hunting cabin on Lake Guntersville. What happened at that cabin is something investigators can only reconstruct from evidence and educated guesses. But what's certain is that Coraline and Jonas died there, and Howard disposed of their bodies in the lake, weighing them down with rocks or concrete, ensuring they'd sink to the bottom and stay there. He then drove the Ford van back toward Coleman, parking it in the woods on Henry Blackwell's property, where it would eventually be found. He tried to make it look like maybe they'd had an accident or run off the road. But he didn't count on Jonas having taken photographs, didn't count on Bobby Jenkins noticing him in the parking lot, didn't count on the fact that someday technology would advance to the point where his DNA on that rope would identify him definitively. Howard Fenwick lived another 37 years after murdering Coraline Whitlock and Jonas Concaid. He died of natural causes in 1989, surrounded by family, having never faced justice for what he'd done. He took his secrets to the grave, or so he thought. But DNA doesn't forget. Photographs preserve moments in time, and the truth, no matter how deeply buried, no matter how many decades pass, has a way of rising to the surface. In January 2023, the Alabama Attorney General's office held a press conference. Standing before a room full of reporters, camera crews, and family members of Coraline and Jonas, the Attorney General announced that the 70-year-old cold case had been solved. Howard Fenwick, deceased since 1989, had been identified as the killer through DNA evidence, photographic evidence, and witness testimony. While Mr. Fenwick cannot be prosecuted, cannot face trial, cannot be held accountable in a court of law, the Attorney General said, he has been held accountable by science and by truth. The families of Coraline Whitlock and Jonas Concaid finally know what happened to their loved ones, finally know who took them. And that knowledge, while it cannot undo the past, provides a measure of closure that has been denied for 7 decades. Margaret Whitlock Freeman, Coraline's niece, spoke at the press conference. She was 70 years old, her voice shaking with emotion. My Aunt Coraline was 23 when she was murdered. I never got to meet her. She died 15 years before I was born. But I grew up hearing stories about her, how kind she was, how excited she was about marrying Jonas, how much she loved life. And I grew up knowing that someone had taken that life from her, and that person had never been caught. Today, finally, there's justice. Not the justice we would have wanted, which would have been seeing Howard Fenwick arrested and prosecuted, but justice nonetheless. We know what happened. We know who did it. And that matters. That matters so much. David Concaid, Jonas's nephew, also spoke. My Uncle Jonas was my father's older brother. My father talked about him all the time when I was growing up. How smart Jonas was. How funny. How he was going to make something of himself. and then he was just gone. Stolen. For 70 years, my family has lived with that loss, that absence. My grandfather died not knowing what happened to his son. My grandmother died not knowing. But today, because of modern science, because of investigators who refuse to give up, because of people who cared enough to keep searching for answers, we know. And I hope Jonas and Coraline, wherever they are, finally have peace. The press conference made national news. Major media outlets across the country ran stories about the cold case that had been solved 7 decades later. The story had everything. Young love cut tragically short, a monster hiding in plain sight, groundbreaking forensic science, and a family's 70-year wait for answers. But beyond the headlines and the media coverage, there was something more profound happening. The case became a symbol of hope for other families dealing with unsolved cases. It proved that no case is ever truly cold, that advances in technology can crack open investigations that seemed hopeless, that DNA databases and genetic genealogy can identify killers decades after they thought they'd gotten away with it. In the months following the press conference, dozens of other cold cases across Alabama were reopened. DNA evidence that had been sitting in storage for years, decades even, was sent to labs for retesting using modern techniques. And those efforts paid off. Several additional cold cases from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s were solved using the same combination of DNA analysis and genealogical research that had cracked the Whitlock-Concaid case. One of those cases was the murder of Ruth Ann Parker, the young woman whose body had been found in 1946. When investigators re-examined the evidence from that case, they found a piece of fabric clutched in Ruth Ann's hand, something that had been documented but never properly tested. DNA extracted from that fabric was compared against the DNA profile from Howard Fenwick. It was a match. Howard Fenwick hadn't just killed twice. He'd killed at least 3 times. And given the 6-year gap between Ruth Ann's murder and the murder of Coraline and Jonas, investigators began to wonder, were there other victims? Other young women or couples who disappeared in Alabama between 1946 and 1952, whose cases had never been solved. A task force was formed to investigate this possibility. Detectives reviewed every unsolved disappearance and murder in Alabama from that era, looking for cases that might fit Howard Fenwick's pattern. They identified 7 possible cases where the circumstances, timing, and location suggested a potential connection to Fenwick. In 3 of those cases, evidence still existed and could be tested. In 2 of those 3, DNA evidence linked Howard Fenwick to the crimes. 2 more murders, 2 more families, who finally got answers after decades of uncertainty. By the time the task force completed its work in late 2023, Howard Fenwick had been conclusively linked to 5 murders. Ruth Ann Parker in 1946, Coraline Whitlock, and Jonas Concaid in 1952, and 2 other young women, Patricia Goodwin in 1948 and Susan Delacroix in 1950, whose cases had been unsolved for over 70 years. Howard Fenwick, the respected community member, the churchgoer, the Little League coach, the man who'd lived a seemingly normal life until his death in 1989, was actually a serial killer. He'd murdered at least 5 people over a 6-year period, possibly more. He'd hidden his crimes behind a facade of respectability, and he'd very nearly gotten away with it. But he didn't. Because DNA doesn't lie. Because photographs preserve truth. Because investigators like Sarah Chen and specialists like Dr. Bradshaw refuse to let these cases remain unsolved. And because families like the Whitlocks and the Concaids never gave up hope that someday, somehow, justice would be served. The case also highlighted something else: the importance of genealogical databases and the people who contribute to them. The DNA matches that helped identify Howard Fenwick came from distant relatives who'd submitted their own DNA to genealogy websites, hoping to learn more about their family trees. They had no idea that their genetic information would help solve multiple murders. But it did. This raised ethical questions, of course. Questions about privacy, about consent, about the use of genetic information for purposes beyond what people intended when they submitted their DNA. These are complex issues without easy answers. But for the families of murder victims, for people who've spent decades without answers, the benefits seem to outweigh the concerns. "I don't care how they caught him," Margaret Whitlock Freeman said in a later interview. "I don't care what technology they used or whose DNA database they accessed. All I care about is that my Aunt Coraline and Jonas finally have justice, that their killer has been identified, that their families finally have answers. That's all that matters to me." The Whitlock Concaid case also changed how law enforcement approaches cold cases. Prior to this case, many agencies assumed that cases more than 50 years old were essentially unsolvable. The evidence was too degraded. Witnesses were dead. The trail had gone too cold. But the successful resolution of this case proved that assumption wrong. Now, police departments across the country are taking second looks at their oldest unsolved cases. They're sending old evidence to labs for retesting. They're working with genetic genealogists. They're using modern technology to analyze evidence that was barely understood when it was first collected. And they're getting results. In the 2 years since the Whitlock Concaid case was solved, over 300 cold cases across the United States have been cracked using similar techniques. 300 families who thought they'd never get answers suddenly have them. 300 killers who thought they'd gotten away with it have been identified, even if many of them are now deceased. This is the power of modern forensic science. This is what happens when dedicated investigators refuse to give up. This is justice, delayed, but not denied. For the descendants of Coraline Whitlock and Jonas Concaid, the resolution of the case brought a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that they finally knew what happened. Satisfaction that the killer had been identified. Sadness that it took 70 years. Anger that Howard Fenwick lived a long, apparently happy life, while Coraline and Jonas's lives were cut short. Grief for all the years lost, all the questions unanswered, all the pain endured by their grandparents and parents who died without knowing the truth. But mostly, there was gratitude. Gratitude to the investigators who never stopped caring about a case from 70 years ago. Gratitude to the forensic scientists who developed the technology that made solving this case possible. Gratitude to the genetic genealogists who volunteered their time and expertise. And gratitude to the anonymous individuals whose DNA submissions to genealogy databases provided the crucial links that identified Howard Fenwick. In the summer of 2023, a memorial service was held for Coraline Whitlock and Jonas Concaid at a small church in Coleman, Alabama. It was the first time anyone had gathered specifically to remember them in decades. Family members came from across the country. Old friends, now elderly themselves, made the journey. Even some of the investigators who'd worked the case over the years attended. The service was simple. Photographs of Coraline and Jonas were displayed, young and smiling, full of life and promise. Family members spoke about the people they'd been, the dreams they'd had, the future that had been stolen from them. A local minister, who hadn't even been born when Coraline and Jonas disappeared, spoke about justice and closure and the importance of never forgetting. And then, in a gesture that had been planned by the families, everyone in attendance walked together to Lake Guntersville, to the spot where, 70 years after their deaths, Coraline and Jonas had finally been found. A marker had been placed there, a simple stone with both their names, their birth dates, and the date they disappeared. Not the date they were found, not the date they died, the date they vanished, because that was the day their family's world changed forever. We wanted them to be remembered, Margaret Whitlock Freeman explained. Not as victims, not as crime statistics, but as people. As Coraline and Jonas. As two young people who loved each other and had their whole lives ahead of them. As someone's daughter and someone's son. As real people who mattered. The story of Coraline Whitlock and Jonas Concaid is tragic, but it's also, in its way, hopeful. It's a reminder that the truth matters, that justice matters, that solving these cases, even decades later, even when the killer is beyond the reach of earthly justice, still has value. Because families need closure, because the dead deserve to be remembered, because society needs to know that murder, no matter how long ago, no matter how cleverly concealed, will eventually be exposed. The case also serves as a warning to anyone who thinks they can get away with murder. DNA doesn't have a statute of limitations. Genetic genealogy can reach back through generations. And law enforcement agencies across the country are now actively working to solve cold cases using these techniques. If you committed a crime 20, 30, 50, even 70 years ago and think you've gotten away with it, think again. The evidence is still out there. The technology exists. And investigators are looking. Howard Fenwick thought he'd gotten away with murder. For 37 years after killing Coraline and Jonas, he lived a normal life. He raised his children. He went to work every day. He attended church on Sundays. He died peacefully in his bed, surrounded by family, never having faced consequences for what he'd done. But he didn't get away with it. Not really. Because now everyone knows what he did. His name will forever be associated with these crimes. His legacy isn't that of an upstanding community member, it's that of a serial killer. And his victims, Coraline and Jonas, and Ruth Ann, and Patricia, and Susan, are no longer forgotten. They're remembered, they're honored, and their stories have been told. This is why we investigate cold cases. This is why we develop new forensic techniques. This is why we never give up, even when decades have passed and all the original investigators have retired or died and the families have lost hope. Because every victim deserves justice. Every family deserves answers. And every killer, no matter how long they hide, deserves to be exposed. The Lake Guntersville case has had ripple effects throughout the true crime community and law enforcement agencies across the country. It's been featured in documentaries, podcasts, and articles. It's been studied in forensic science classes and criminal justice programs. It's become a case study in how modern technology can solve seemingly impossible cases. But more than that, it's given hope to thousands of families dealing with unsolved cases. It's proven that no case is ever truly hopeless. That evidence that seemed useless decades ago might hold the key to solving a case today. That advances in technology create new possibilities for justice. The families of other cold case victims have reached out to investigators with renewed hope, asking if their loved ones' cases might also be solvable using these techniques. Law enforcement agencies are working through backlogs of old evidence, prioritizing cases where DNA evidence exists that could be retested. Forensic labs are developing even more advanced techniques for extracting and analyzing DNA from degraded samples. The field of forensic genetic genealogy is expanding rapidly. More specialists are being trained, more resources are being allocated to cold case investigations, and more cases are being solved as a result. In 2024, just 2 years after the Whitlock-Concaid case was solved, a national database was created specifically for unsolved homicides. The database includes DNA profiles, photographs, case details, and investigative information for thousands of unsolved murders across the country. It's accessible to law enforcement agencies nationwide and is designed to facilitate information sharing and collaboration. The database is named the Whitlock Concaid Database, in honor of the case that proved just how powerful these tools can be. It's a fitting memorial to two young people whose deaths, while tragic, have led to advances that have helped solve hundreds of other cases and bring closure to hundreds of other families. Margaret Whitlock Freeman and David Concaid both serve on the advisory board for the database. They've become advocates for cold case investigation, speaking at conferences, working with legislators to secure funding for forensic testing, and supporting other families dealing with unsolved cases. "If some good can come from my aunt's death," Margaret has said, "if her case can help solve other cases, if other families can get the answers we finally got, then maybe there's some meaning in all of this. It doesn't change what happened. It doesn't bring Coraline back. But it honors her memory in a way that matters." The detective who led the renewed investigation, Sarah Chen, has also become a prominent figure in the cold case community. She's testified before Congress about the importance of funding for forensic testing. She's worked with the FBI to develop best practices for cold case investigations. And she's helped train other detectives in how to use modern forensic techniques to solve old cases. "The Whitlock Concaid case changed my career," Sarah has said. "It showed me what's possible when you combine traditional detective work with cutting-edge science. It taught me to never give up on a case, no matter how old or how cold. And it reinforced something I've always believed, that every victim deserves justice and every family deserves answers, no matter how long it takes to get them." The forensic genealogist who helped identify Howard Fenwick, Dr. Michael Bradshaw, has also seen his career transformed by the case. He's now one of the most sought-after experts in the field, working on dozens of cold cases across the country. He's helped develop new techniques for building family trees from DNA matches, and he's trained a new generation of genetic genealogists who are using these skills to solve cases. Genetic genealogy is an incredibly powerful tool, Dr. Bradshaw has explained. But it's also complex and time-consuming. Each case requires hundreds of hours of research, building family trees, verifying relationships, tracking down leads. It's detective work meets genealogical research, meets genetic science. But when it works, when you're able to identify someone who committed a crime decades ago, it's incredibly satisfying. You've given a family answers. You've brought a killer to justice, even if only in the court of public opinion. You've proven that the truth matters, and that murder will not be forgotten. The specialist who developed the degraded film from Jonas's camera, Dr. Patricia Thornton, has also continued working on cold cases. She's recovered images from dozens of old cameras and film rolls found at crime scenes or in evidence lockers. Some of those images have provided crucial evidence in solving cases. Film is remarkably resilient, Dr. Thornton has said. Even when it's been exposed to water, heat, cold, or just time, there's often still information there that can be recovered. The key is using the right techniques and being patient. The images Jonas Concaid took that night, 70 years before I developed that film, were the voice he couldn't use himself. They told us what happened. They showed us who was following them. They provided evidence that, combined with other information, helped solve the case. That's the power of photography, of preservation, of never giving up on evidence no matter how old it is. The Lake Guntersville case has also had an impact on how evidence is preserved and stored. Law enforcement agencies across the country have reviewed their evidence storage practices, ensuring that old evidence is properly maintained and cataloged so that it can be accessed and retested when new techniques become available. There's a recognition now that evidence from cases decades old might still be valuable, might still be testable, might still provide answers. So instead of destroying old evidence after a certain number of years, Many agencies are keeping it indefinitely, understanding that today's unsolvable case might be tomorrow's breakthrough. The case has also raised public awareness about cold cases and the families dealing with them. Before the Whitlock Concaid case made headlines, most people probably didn't think much about unsolved murders from decades ago. They assumed those cases were essentially dead, that the trail was too cold, that there was nothing to be done. But the successful resolution of this case and the hundreds of other cold cases solved using similar techniques has changed that perception. People now understand that these cases can be solved, that families have been waiting decades for answers, that modern science provides tools that didn't exist when these crimes were committed. This increased awareness has led to increased support for cold case investigations. More funding, more resources, more public interest, and that, in turn, has led to more cases being solved. The victims of these crimes are no longer forgotten. Their families are no longer alone in their grief and frustration. And the killers who thought they'd gotten away with murder are being identified and exposed, their crimes brought to light no matter how many years have passed. This is the legacy of the Lake Guntersville case. This is what Coraline Whitlock and Jonas Concaid, two young people who were murdered 70 years ago, have given to the world. Not through their deaths, but through the investigation that finally brought them justice. Through the techniques developed and refined to solve their case. Through the hope their story has given to other families. Through the awareness their case has raised about cold cases and the importance of never giving up on them. Their story is tragic, but it's also powerful. It's a testament to the resilience of families who never stopped hoping for answers. It's a tribute to investigators who refuse to let a case go cold. It's proof of the power of modern science to reach across decades and identify the guilty. And it's a reminder that justice, while it may be delayed, is never truly denied. So tonight, as we conclude this journey into one of Alabama's most haunting mysteries, I want you to remember Coraline Whitlock and Jonas Concaid, not as victims of a 70-year-old crime, but as people. As a young woman who loved life and was planning her wedding. As a young man who loved photography and dreamed of the future. As two people who loved each other and had their lives stolen from them by a monster hiding in plain sight. Remember them, honor them, and remember that their story, tragic as it is, has helped bring justice to hundreds of other families. Their legacy isn't just their deaths. It's the lives they've touched, the cases they've helped solve, the hope they've given to others. This is Cold Case Reels, where we never stop searching for the truth, where we believe that every victim deserves justice, no matter how long it takes, where we honor the dead by telling their stories and fighting for answers. If this story moved you, if you believe in the power of justice and the importance of never forgetting, I need you to do something for me right now. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another case. Drop a like on this video to show your support for the families still waiting for answers. And leave a comment below. Tell me your thoughts on this case. Tell me if you believe that justice delayed is still justice. Tell me about cold cases in your area that need attention. Your engagement helps this channel grow, and the more we grow, the more stories we can tell, the more awareness we can raise, the more pressure we can put on law enforcement to keep working these cases. And most importantly, if you're dealing with an unsolved case in your own family, if you're one of the thousands of people still waiting for answers about a loved one who was murdered or disappeared, know this: you're not alone. Technology is advancing every day. New techniques are being developed. Cases that seemed impossible to solve are being cracked open. Don't give up hope. Keep pushing for answers. Keep demanding that investigators look at your loved one's case. Because as the story of Coraline and Jonas proves, No case is ever truly cold. The truth is out there, waiting to be discovered. The drought that exposed Lake Guntersville's secrets in 2022 was a natural disaster that caused tremendous hardship for Alabama. But it also brought something unexpected: justice. The receding waters revealed what had been hidden for 70 years. And that revelation set in motion a chain of events that not only solved the Whitlock Concaid case, but also led to the solving of hundreds of other cold cases across the country. Sometimes the worst circumstances can lead to the best outcomes. Sometimes disasters reveal hidden truths. And sometimes, just when we think a case is hopeless, when we think the trail has gone too cold, when we think justice will never be served, the universe has a way of proving us wrong. The mud at the bottom of Lake Guntersville held its secrets for 70 years. But when the time came, when the water receded and the bones were exposed, the truth finally emerged. And with it came justice for two young people who'd been waiting 7 decades to have their story told. This is why we investigate. This is why we search. This is why we never give up. Because the truth matters. Because families deserve answers. Because the dead deserve justice. And because killers, no matter how long they hide, no matter how respectable they appear, no matter how many years pass, deserve to be exposed and remembered for what they really were. Howard Fenwick's family has had to live with the knowledge that their father, grandfather, and husband was a serial killer. That's a burden they didn't ask for, and don't deserve. But they've handled it with grace and dignity. They've cooperated with investigators. They've expressed sympathy for the victims' families. And they've made clear that they in no way condone or excuse what Howard Fenwick did. Richard Fenwick, Howard's son, has said in multiple interviews that coming forward with what he remembered from childhood was one of the hardest things he's ever done. I was torn, he admitted. Part of me wanted to protect my father's memory, wanted to believe that maybe I'd misunderstood what I heard that night. But I knew the truth. I'd known it my whole life, really. I just hadn't wanted to face it. And when Detective Chen came to me and explained about the DNA evidence, about the photographs, about everything they'd found, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. Those families deserved the truth. Coraline and Jonas deserved justice, and my father deserved to be remembered for what he really was, not the lie he presented to the world. Richard has also become an advocate for recognizing the warning signs of violent behavior. My father was violent at home, he said. My mother knew it. I knew it. My sister knew it. But no one outside our family knew because we didn't talk about it. That was normal back then. Domestic violence was something that happened behind closed doors and stayed behind closed doors. But that's wrong. Violence at home is often a precursor to violence elsewhere. If someone is willing to hurt their family, they're capable of hurting strangers. We need to recognize that. We need to take it seriously. And we need to provide resources for people to get away from violent situations before they escalate. The case has also highlighted the importance of witness testimony, even decades after a crime. Bobby Jenkins, the trucker who saw the man in the gray fedora watching Coraline and Jonas, died in 2005. But his testimony, given to police in 1952 and preserved in the case file, proved crucial to solving the case 70 years later. His observations about the man's behavior, about the way he watched the young couple, about the car that followed them, all of it helped investigators piece together what happened that night. Dorothy Mills, the waitress at the Highway Diner, died in 1998. But her detailed recollections of Coraline and Jonas, preserved in multiple police interviews, helped investigators understand who the victims were as people, not just names in a case file. Her testimony about how happy they seemed, how in love, how completely normal their evening was until they walked out into that parking lot, all of it matters, because it reminds us that these were real people with real lives who were stolen from their families and from the world. The other witnesses from that night, the cook at the diner, the other truckers in the parking lot, most of them are gone now. But their words, preserved in the original case file, helped paint a picture of that night that was crucial to understanding what happened. This is why documentation matters. This is why investigators need to be thorough, need to interview everyone, need to write down every detail, no matter how insignificant it might seem at the time. Because you never know what piece of information will prove crucial decades down the line. The highway diner itself is long gone. It closed sometime in the 1970s, and the building was eventually demolished. A convenience store stands on the spot now, but the location is marked with a small memorial plaque placed there by the families of Coraline and Jonas. It reads, "In memory of Coraline Whitlock and Jonas Concaid, who stopped here on August 15, 1952. Gone but not forgotten. Justice delayed but not denied." The plaque has become a place of pilgrimage for true crime enthusiasts and for people interested in the case. Visitors leave flowers, notes, tokens of remembrance. It's become an informal memorial, a place to honor two young people whose lives were cut short, and to acknowledge the importance of never giving up the search for truth. Highway 31 itself looks very different now than it did in 1952. It's been widened, repaved, modernized. The forests that once pressed close to the road have been cleared for development in many areas. The small towns along the route have changed, some growing, others shrinking. But the highway still runs through Alabama, still carries travelers from one destination to another, just as it did 70 years ago when Coraline and Jonas drove north into the darkness. Lake Guntersville, too, has changed over the decades. It's a popular recreation spot now, with marinas, campgrounds, and resorts along its shores. People fish there, swim there, enjoy the natural beauty. But now there's a shadow over it, a knowledge that for 70 years it held a terrible secret. The lake that gives life and pleasure to thousands also concealed death and tragedy. The drought that exposed Coraline and Jonas's remains ended eventually, as droughts do. The rains returned, the water levels rose, and the lake covered the shoreline where their bones were found. But the truth that was revealed can never be concealed again. The secret is out. The mystery is solved. And the lake, for all its beauty, will always be remembered as the place where justice finally emerged after 7 decades of silence. The investigation into Howard Fenwick's crimes continues, even though he's been dead for over 30 years. Investigators are still reviewing unsolved cases from the 1940s and 50s, looking for other possible victims. They're comparing DNA evidence where it exists. They're looking at patterns, at geographical connections, at timing. Because if Howard Fenwick killed 5 people that we know of, there's a possibility he killed more. Serial killers rarely stop on their own. They're usually caught, die, or become physically unable to continue their crimes. Howard Fenwick's killing spree appears to have ended in 1952 with the murder of Coraline and Jonas. Why did he stop? That's a question that may never be fully answered. Perhaps the investigation into their disappearance scared him. Perhaps he had a close call that made him realize he might get caught. Perhaps he found other outlets for his violent impulses. Or perhaps he didn't stop, and there are victims we haven't yet connected to him. This uncertainty is difficult for families dealing with unsolved cases from that era. Every time news breaks about another case potentially linked to Howard Fenwick, families of other missing or murdered young people wonder, could this be connected to my loved one's case? Could Howard Fenwick have killed my sister, my daughter, my mother? The task force investigating these connections takes each potential case seriously. They review the evidence carefully compare the circumstances, run DNA tests where possible. They don't want to give families false hope, but they also don't want to dismiss legitimate possibilities. It's a delicate balance, and it requires sensitivity and thoroughness. So far, 5 murders have been definitively linked to Howard Fenwick through DNA evidence. 3 others remain under investigation, with circumstantial evidence suggesting a possible connection, but no definitive proof. And there are dozens of other unsolved cases from that era that might or might not be connected. The investigation continues. What we know for certain is that Howard Fenwick was a predator who hid behind a facade of respectability. He was a family man who murdered other people's family members. He was a churchgoer who committed sins of the darkest kind. He was a community leader who preyed on his community. He was a monster disguised as a normal man. And he's not unique. Throughout history, throughout the present day, there are people who present one face to the world while hiding their true nature. They're the neighbors everyone likes, the co-workers everyone trusts, the community members everyone respects, and all the while, they're committing terrible crimes, secure in the belief that their disguise will protect them. But increasingly, that disguise isn't enough. DNA evidence can't be fooled by a friendly smile or a respectable reputation. Genealogical databases don't care about someone's standing in the community, and dedicated investigators won't be swayed by the fact that a suspect was well-liked or seemingly upstanding. This is perhaps the most important lesson from the Lake Guntersville case. Appearances can be deceiving, but science tells the truth. Howard Fenwick fooled his community for decades. He fooled his family. He fooled everyone except his victims, who knew exactly what he was. But in the end, his DNA exposed him. The truth emerged. Justice, while delayed, was served. The case has also raised important discussions about how we view serial killers. There's a tendency in popular culture to portray serial killers as obviously strange or disturbed, as outcasts who stand apart from normal society. But the reality is often very different. Many serial killers are skilled at blending in, at presenting as normal or even exemplary citizens. They hold jobs, maintain relationships, participate in their communities, and all the while, they're committing murders. Howard Fenwick was by all accounts a skilled manipulator. He knew how to present himself. He knew what behaviors would be seen as normal and acceptable. He knew how to deflect suspicion. When he was questioned about Ruth Ann Parker's disappearance in 1946, he appeared cooperative and concerned. He answered questions readily. He seemed genuinely upset about the young woman's death. And he provided an alibi that was corroborated by his wife, who likely believed him or was too frightened to contradict him. This ability to manipulate, to deceive, to appear normal while harboring dark impulses is characteristic of many serial killers. It's how they avoid detection for so long. It's how they accumulate multiple victims before anyone connects the crimes. And it's why cases like this can go unsolved for decades. But modern forensic techniques have changed the game. A charming personality can't override DNA evidence. A respectable reputation can't erase genetic markers. And the ability to manipulate people doesn't extend to manipulating science. This is why investment in forensic technology is so crucial. Every advance in DNA analysis, every improvement in evidence processing, every new technique for extracting information from degraded samples, all of it contributes to our ability to solve crimes and identify criminals. The techniques that solved the Whitlock-Concaid case didn't exist when the crime was committed. They didn't even exist 20 years ago. They're cutting-edge science, constantly evolving, constantly improving. And as these techniques continue to advance, more cold cases will be solved. More families will get answers. More killers will be identified. The passage of time will no longer be a shield for criminals. The belief that if you can just avoid detection long enough, you'll get away with murder, that belief is increasingly obsolete. The Lake Guntersville case proves this beyond any doubt. 70 years passed between the murders and the identification of the killer. 7 decades during which Howard Fenwick lived his life, confident that he'd never face consequences for his crimes. 7 decades during which Coraline and Jonas's families suffered without answers. 7 decades during which it seemed like justice would never come. But it did come. Late, but it came. And that matters. It matters to the families who finally have closure. It matters to society, which needs to know that murder will not be tolerated or forgotten. And it matters to other criminals who might think they've gotten away with their crimes. Because the message is clear. There is no statute of limitations on DNA. There is no expiration date on justice. And there is no guarantee that the passage of time will protect you. The case has also had an impact on how we think about cold cases more broadly. For years, many people assumed that if a case went unsolved for more than a few years, it would likely never be solved. The trail gets too cold. Witnesses die or forget crucial details. Evidence degrades. And eventually, the case gets filed away and forgotten. But the Whitlock Concaid case, along with hundreds of other recently solved cold cases, has proven that assumption wrong. Cases can be solved decades later. Evidence that was useless in the past can be invaluable now. And witnesses' testimony, preserved in case files, can provide crucial information even after those witnesses have died. This has led to a renewed focus on cold cases across the country. Police departments are creating or expanding cold case units. State and federal agencies are providing funding for evidence testing. Non-profit organizations are forming to support cold case investigations. And genealogists are volunteering their time and expertise to help solve these cases. The result has been a surge in solved cold cases. In just the past 5 years, over 1,000 cold cases have been solved using modern forensic techniques. 1,000 families who thought they'd never get answers suddenly have them. 1,000 criminals who thought they'd gotten away with murder have been identified and exposed. And this is just the beginning. As techniques continue to improve, as databases continue to grow, as more resources are devoted to cold case investigations, that number will only increase. We're entering a new era of criminal justice, one where the past can be examined with unprecedented clarity, where old evidence can yield new insights, where cold cases can be brought back to life. The families of victims are the primary beneficiaries of this new era. People who've spent decades wondering what happened to their loved ones are finally getting answers. People who've lived with the knowledge that someone murdered their family member and was never caught are finally seeing that killer identified. People who've felt forgotten by the justice system are finally seeing that their loved one's case matters, that investigators haven't given up, that justice is still possible. Margaret Whitlock Freeman has spoken about this frequently. For 70 years, my family carried the weight of not knowing, she's said. Every family gathering, every holiday, every celebration, there was this shadow over it, this awareness that Coraline should be here and isn't, this knowledge that someone murdered her and got away with it. It affected my grandmother profoundly. It affected my father, who was Coraline's younger brother. It affected all of us, even those of us who were born after she died. And then, finally, we got answers. We found out what happened, learned who did it. And while it didn't erase the pain, while it didn't bring Coraline back, it gave us something we'd never had before. Closure. The ability to finally grieve properly. The knowledge that justice, even if delayed, was finally served. This is what cold case investigations provide. Closure. The ability to finally know what happened. The end of the torment of not knowing. The peace that comes with having answers, even when those answers are painful. But cold case investigations also provide something else: accountability. When a killer is identified decades after their crime, even if they're already dead, their name becomes associated with that crime. Their legacy is tainted. The lie they lived is exposed, and society knows who they really were. Howard Fenwick's obituary from 1989, published in the local Coleman newspaper, described him as a beloved husband, father, and grandfather, a pillar of the community, a man who would be greatly missed. Reading that obituary now, knowing what we know about him, is jarring. The disconnect between the person described in that obituary and the reality of who Howard Fenwick was is profound. But now, whenever someone searches for information about Howard Fenwick, they don't find that sanitized obituary first. They find articles about the murders he committed. They find details about his crimes. They find the truth. His legacy has been rewritten, not by speculation or rumor, but by science and evidence. This matters. It matters for the victims' families, who need to know that the killer is remembered as a killer, not as a respectable citizen. It matters for society, which needs accurate information about who people really were. And it matters as a deterrent. Would-be criminals need to understand that even if they avoid detection during their lifetime, even if they die believing they've gotten away with their crimes, the truth can still come out. Their legacy can still be destroyed. Their name can still be forever associated with what they did. The Lake Guntersville case has become a touchstone for discussions about justice, about the role of technology in criminal investigations, about the importance of never giving up on victims. It's been featured in countless articles, documentaries, podcasts, and academic discussions. It's been studied by criminologists, forensic scientists, and law enforcement professionals. And it's become a symbol of hope for families dealing with unsolved cases. But beyond all the attention, beyond all the analysis and discussion, at the heart of this case are two people: Coraline Whitlock and Jonas Concaid. Two young people who loved each other and were planning their future together. Two people who stopped at a diner one August night and never made it to their next destination. Two people whose lives were stolen by a killer who thought he'd never face consequences. Coraline was 23 years old. She loved to read, especially mystery novels. She worked as a secretary at a local insurance office and was known for her kindness and her bright smile. She was close to her family, especially her younger brother. She loved music, particularly the new rock and roll songs that were becoming popular. She dreamed of traveling, of seeing the world beyond Alabama, of experiencing all that life had to offer. Jonas was 25. He loved photography, spending hours taking pictures of landscapes, people, everyday moments. He worked as a mechanic and was known for his skill with engines and his willingness to help anyone who needed repairs. He loved the outdoors, hiking and camping whenever he could. He was patient and kind, with a quiet sense of humor that made people comfortable around him. They met at a church social in the spring of 1952. Their courtship was brief but intense. Within a few months, they knew they wanted to spend their lives together. Jonas proposed in July, and they set a wedding date for October. The road trip they were taking when they were murdered was meant to be a final adventure before settling into married life. They never got that chance. Their wedding never happened. Their dreams never came to fruition. Their future was stolen by Howard Fenwick, who saw them as targets, as victims, as objects for his violence, rather than as human beings, with hopes and dreams and people who loved them. This is what murder really is. It's not just the ending of a life. It's the destruction of potential. It's the theft of all the moments that should have been. all the experiences that will never happen, all the love that will never be shared, all the contributions to the world that will never be made. Coraline and Jonas should have gotten married in October 1952. They should have had children. They should have grown old together. They should have celebrated anniversaries and birthdays and holidays. They should have been grandparents and great-grandparents. They should have lived full, long lives. Instead, they were murdered at 23 and 25. Their families spent 70 years without them, without their presence at family gatherings, without their voices and laughter, without the children and grandchildren they should have had. The ripple effects of their murders touched countless lives. Parents who lost a child, siblings who lost a brother and a sister, nieces and nephews who never got to meet their aunt and uncle, generations of family members who grew up with the shadow of this tragedy hanging over them. This is what Howard Fenwick took. Not just 2 lives, but all the potential those lives held. All the joy they would have brought. All the love they would have shared. All the positive impact they would have had on the world. And for what? Why did Howard Fenwick kill Coraline and Jonas? What motivated him to follow them from the highway diner and murder them? That's a question that may never be fully answered. Howard is dead, unable to explain himself. And even if he were alive, serial killers often can't or won't articulate why they do what they do. Investigators believe, based on the pattern of Howard's crimes, that he targeted young women, usually those who were vulnerable or alone. Ruth Ann Parker was walking alone when he approached her. Patricia Goodwin and Susan Delacroix were both alone when they disappeared. Coraline was with Jonas, which was unusual for Howard's pattern, but perhaps he saw them as a couple and wanted to prove he could overpower both of them. Or perhaps something about Coraline specifically attracted his attention, and Jonas was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. We'll never know for certain. What we do know is that Howard Fenwick was a predator who stalked and killed innocent people for his own gratification. He was a monster who hid behind a mask of respectability, and he almost got away with it. Almost. But not quite. Because 7 decades later, science and persistence and the refusal of investigators to give up brought the truth to light. And now, Howard Fenwick is remembered not as a pillar of the community, but as a serial killer. His victims are remembered not as statistics or cold case files, but as people who mattered, who were loved, who deserved so much better than what happened to them. The memorial at Lake Guntersville, where Coraline and Jonas's remains were found, has become a place of reflection. People visit to pay their respects, to leave flowers, to think about the fragility of life and the importance of justice. The marker is simple, just a stone with their names and dates, but it represents so much more. It represents 70 years of waiting, 70 years of pain, and finally, the end of not knowing, the beginning of healing. Margaret Whitlock Freeman visits the memorial several times a year. She brings flowers from her garden, the same flowers that Coraline loved. She sits by the water and talks to her aunt, telling her about the family she never got to meet, about the life she missed, about how she's never been forgotten. I tell her about my children and my grandchildren, Margaret says. I tell her that she would have loved them, and they would have loved her. I tell her about our family's accomplishments and struggles, about weddings and birthdays, and all the things she should have been there for. I tell her that we never stopped looking for her,
never stopped hoping for answers. And I tell her that finally she has justice, that the man who killed her has been exposed, that everyone knows what he did, that she and Jonas are remembered and honored. David Concaid also visits the memorial regularly. He brings his own children and grandchildren, wanting them to understand their family history, to know about the uncle they never met, to appreciate the importance of the justice that was finally achieved. It's important that they know, David says, not just about the tragedy, but about the perseverance, about how our family never gave up, about how investigators kept working the case even when it seemed hopeless, about how modern science made it possible to finally solve a 70-year-old mystery. That's a powerful lesson. It teaches them that justice matters, that truth matters, that we should never give up even when things seem impossible. The Lake Guntersville case has become part of American criminal history. It's taught in forensic science classes as an example of how modern techniques can solve old cases. It's discussed in ethics classes as an example of the importance of justice and closure. It's featured in journalism classes as an example of how to cover sensitive topics with respect and accuracy.